We are recording. It's March 10, 2021, and we are going through Gateway API meeting. We have a few things to cover, but mostly this is going to be PR and issue triage. Thanks to everyone. There's been a lot of PRs and issues coming in over the past week, and I think we've got plenty to discuss. And I should note, I think this time I added everything to the agenda, but anyone is welcome to add anything to the agenda at any point. So feel free even during this meeting or, in preparation for the next one, if there's something you want to bring up, don't hesitate to add it. But one of the things that I think is top of mind for me and probably many others is what we want to do for our next releases. I think we've come to the conclusion that we have enough breaking changes that we're going to need a V1 Alpha 2. So we have a milestone for that. We have a number of issues in there. It seems like we'd likely also have a number of iterative things, smaller additive changes or bug fixes that we could fit into a 0.3.0. I've thrown a few ideas out there. Like I know we've discussed potentially health checks. I know timeouts. There's already an old PR, but a PR that is related to timeouts. There's been some discussion about maybe we can restrict gateway class, the gateway classes of gateways that can use a route. Various things like that would be additive, maybe could fit into an 0.3.0. I'm curious if anyone else has been thinking about release cycle and what we might want to do next. Is there value in a 0.3.0 release, and are there things we really want to be adding to an API before we get to V1 Alpha 2, or do we want to go full force towards V1 Alpha 2?
I guess keeping up with the main tag for me would be helpful, just to not have to redo everything over and over, since at least the contour implementation isn't fully there. So I guess, yeah, to me it'd be helpful just to stay up to date.
Just to clarify, does that mean continued updates on V1 Alpha 1? So like a V0.3.0, or a new update on like a completely new API version in V1 Alpha 2?
Oh, I see. I don't know. I guess.
I guess doesn't going to V1 Alpha 2 entail actually lots of changes, because the types would be different, wouldn't they?
Yeah, it requires a significant effort. It's something we want to do once, and hopefully only once. I think I would like, so here's where I'm coming from. We keep on getting a number of issues. If you look at the V1 Alpha 2 milestone, it's getting fairly large, in that what we've done is anything that is a breaking change, we've just said, well, that's V1 Alpha 2, and we'll punt it there, and we won't handle that yet. And that makes sense, because we can't do breaking changes while we're still in V1 Alpha 1. So that makes sense. At the same time, what that's resulted in is this relatively large backlog of work to do that's just whenever we get to V1 Alpha 2. So at some point we need to solve how we actually start developing V1 Alpha 2 features, those breaking changes, that new API version, everything else. And related to that, we need to figure out what we want to do before then. So what is in scope before we start working on breaking changes?
Do we know what other groups have done? Because I know from the directory perspective, you can actually have both active at the same time, if I understand it.
Yeah, you absolutely can. I think where that gets a little confusing is our release structure. So let's say we release V0.3.0 and we happen to have V1 Alpha 2 sitting in our repository. We can just say, well, it's not ready yet, but what I've seen some others do is split things out into different branches. So we could start on a V1 Alpha 2 branch, but that of course means that everything you add in V1 Alpha 1, you need to make sure you're bringing it across to V1 Alpha 2. Alternatively, we could have a V1 alpha 1 branch and then main becomes V1 alpha 2. But ideally, the simplest way we do this is we do all the iterative changes first, and then we just switch and start working on breaking changes towards V1 alpha 2. It gets a little messier if you're trying to push forward on both at the same time, at least with every possibility I've thought of. But maybe there's some other way that I'm missing.
So the branch wouldn't, I guess you'd have to handle merge conflicts, but it could be the case that we create the branch, we don't bother porting over the V1 alpha changes, and then when we release it, we just merge it in. Is that too horrible to consider, or?
Well, if we're assuming that anything we're adding to V1 alpha 1 is going to be in V1 alpha 2, it seems like you would want to be porting those changes over to a V1 alpha 2 branch pretty regularly, right?
Right. What I meant is that you wouldn't have to touch the V1 alpha. I'm thinking from the files perspective.
Oh, sure.
Is that, yes, for sure you need to edit the actual APIs, but we could just use Git merging to squish the branches back together when it gets released. I think like we should make it so that the main line is just the main line. Like we shouldn't branch new release branches, I guess, because there's no point in, like, we're not going to backport to the old one, so the branching is not meaningful. How we work on V1 alpha 2, yeah, it feels like having a branch is probably very expensive for the number of people that are involved.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what seems like it would be easiest from, maybe I'm missing things, but what seems like it would be easiest is work on these last round of additive changes, bug fixes we want to include in V1 alpha 1, get one more minor release out of V1 alpha 1, and then transition to V1 alpha 2, and everything in main then is building towards another release that includes the first release of V1 alpha 2.
That makes the most sense. We only have, under 20 active participants. So ideally, we would just not create a ton of new process.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Get everything into 030, and then that also essentially becomes V1 alpha 2, if I understand that correctly.
So I think it sounded to me like Rob, you were saying, cut a V030 with like finish off all the additive stuff, cut a V030, then get started on V1 alpha 2, and then when V1 alpha 2 is ready, cut a V040. That one of the changelog notes is we've revved the API to V1 alpha 2.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. Yeah.
Hey, Rob, can you help me understand though, why is a V1 alpha 2 required as opposed to putting breaking changes in V1 alpha 1? I thought the purpose of like an alpha API was that there would be breaking changes.
Yeah, that theoretically is possible. I think so. One of the things we said at the outset is that V1 alpha releases may still break, but the actual API version would only include additive changes and bug fixes. So we would release additive changes to V1 alpha, whatever, in V1 alpha 1. But if we wanted to break things, we'd release a new API version. That would be V1 alpha 2. And this matches my understanding of what Kubernetes versioning looks like. So let's say we release a V1 beta 1 in Kubernetes upstream. At that point, again, my understanding is you need to be able to round trip everything to any other V1 beta 2, let's say, or V1. Whereas between alpha API versions, you do have some flexibility to say, well, I'm just going to drop this concept or rename, completely break this part in my next API release, my next API version. So I don't, and I could be wrong here, but I don't think that it's very common to break things within an existing API version. And that's certainly something like we said we would avoid in our versioning guidelines. And instead, we're trying to keep at least a single API version in check. I think this will also make it a little bit easier for controllers to play nicely with each other. So let's say someone installs V1 Alpha 1 API somewhere. Any controller that supported any version of V1 Alpha 1 should be able to understand that API. They may understand less or more of it, but they should be able to understand it.
Yeah, I think like, well, yeah, some of it boils down to the implementers. I hope a lot of us are here in this meeting. Is like, if we silently being that there is no version designation, the API, would that present like a big problem? I suspect that it might, because you'd have to keep track of specific Git tags that you were implementing at versus just explicitly in the CRD version.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, right? That as an implementer, you really just want to know, hey, this is a V1, the V1 Alpha 1 API exists in this cluster. I can trust that that is the V1 Alpha 1 I know. It may not have everything I think it has, but it doesn't have just completely broken things. That's been my understanding, and that's certainly what we kind of described in our versioning guidelines. But yeah, open to other approaches here.
Yeah, I'm looking at just different APIs. It looks like kind of the core APIs. You know, I guess I don't even really see any alpha API. I see a few different versions like beta. The cluster API, I see that they've got a couple different alpha versions. I guess my next question is like deprecation. So let's fast forward a year from now and we've got 4 or 5 different alpha versions. Are we expected to support all those versions, or what's the deprecation policy?
My general take is that when we go beta, all of those get sort of deprecated pretty quickly. Of course, it depends on your users, but the expectation is that the beta will just supersede all alpha.
Yeah.
So until we go beta, then we could have potentially a handful of different alpha releases that we need to support.
I think like that again depends on your users, but the message to users up front would be that no, we would try to limit it to only the most recent. It's only as if you had a major customer. Again, that's like on a case-by-case basis that there's a very strong reason to keep people around. My
personal preference, and this is going to be hard to get right, is to really limit the number of alpha releases. I really want, by the time we release V1 Alpha 2, I really want to make sure we have thought about every breaking change we might want to consider and have it somehow incorporated or taken into account in that API version. We're getting to a point where an increasing number of implementations and users will be using these APIs, and there's not going to be a large appetite for breaking changes. I think V1 Alpha 2 really is that opportunity to make breaking changes. And beyond that, I think users may start to expect more stability than breaking changes would allow for. So
no, it makes sense. It's just, you know, the implementations are just starting and they still seem to be very early in the implementations, right? So I would expect that, or especially now that the implementations are just starting to ramp up, that we would more than likely see issues that need to get resolved by implementing some kind of breaking change.
it's this really, I don't know, there's two conflicting sides of that. The more implementations and the more users we have, the more likely we are going to find things that we want to make a breaking change, but the more painful those breaking changes will be. So need to find the right balance there. You know, you think of Kubernetes APIs, it's pretty rare for them to stay in alpha and not graduate to beta within a year, kind of thing. Usually you'd say 2, maybe 3 alpha release cycles, which may just be 1 or 2 alpha APIs, and then it goes to beta. So if we're thinking similar timelines, and no one said we have to do that, but that would be somewhere between 6 and 12 months from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Beta 1. I don't know if we can achieve that, but that sure would be nice.
Yeah, I think the point I was just trying to make, I think it's more than likely that we're gonna see enough issues that we're gonna have to cut more than just V1 Alpha 2 and probably more than just V1 Alpha 3. Yeah, so it just kind of comes down to how many releases, right? Are we going to support 3, 4, 5 different alpha releases, or are we going to go ahead and say that we support the current alpha and the previous alpha release, or am I making a bigger issue out of something than it needs to be?
I think it simply has to be explained to the users that either they should be okay with the breaking changes and only supporting 1.5 versions, essentially, using it in this alpha state, or if it really comes to that, there has to be some other strategy, maybe cloning the types if there's more stability needed into a different API group, but that's not part of this project. Because that's the point of the alpha. Like, otherwise, we're not getting alpha advantages.
One concept that could help us going forward, and we don't have this yet, is the idea of alpha fields or alpha concepts. In upstream, you can gate, well, new fields are always introduced as an alpha and gated and default off kind of thing. And that allows you to just try fields out on a stable API and remove them in the future because you only considered them alpha. That would allow us a little bit more flexibility, even if we were to reach beta and wanted to experiment with a new concept. Again, that's a long ways out, but yeah.
Yeah, my general take is that I wouldn't be, we should be cautious, but we shouldn't be overcautious, right? Like, there is if things are really off, we still have, even for GA APIs and Kubernetes, there is still a path to get it. It's just, it takes longer and more work needs to be done. In some sense, if you have significant users using your alpha and they want stability, it kind of went beta anyways. Like, they are expecting that.
Yeah, it's all about setting appropriate expectations, and I think especially in V1 Alpha 1 and 2, we can set clear expectations that things will break. But if users have been using an API for a few months, let's say, or longer, and have gotten used to it, even if it says alpha, they may not believe that breaking changes. You know, I don't know. Yeah. Well, more to discuss that. Go ahead.
So I just wanted to say, yeah, I think that the key thing to remember here that the primary consumers of the API at this point are the implementers, not like the users who are creating things are running pretty early. And it's the implementers probably who are going to pay the cost of breaking changes more than users, right? Like, yeah, we don't have that many implementations, so yeah, that's all I was trying to say. It's just, yeah, it's probably the implementers that are going to pay the costs right now, and for the next little while. Yeah, I don't I don't see a lot of people like going too hard on actually using APIs for reals until the implementations are a bit more solid, personally.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I'd agree with that, but you know, the problem that we keep on coming to is we won't know every breaking change we want to make until we have more users using it. And by the time we have more users using it, we will have
Breaking changes are harder.
yeah. Yeah, right.
yeah,
So
yeah. It's the classic catch-22. Yeah. I mean, I think that what you've all been saying about having like keeping the alpha until we're reasonably confident that we've got the API mostly dialed in is like, that's the point of the alpha. But it would certainly be good to be able to move it. The sooner we can move this to beta, the better, because that sends a pretty clear signal to the community that, hey, this is actually worth spending a little bit of time having a look at.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, well, it sounds like we have enough to move forward, at least in the next few months, and that is that we're going to be working towards a 0.3.0 release. I can create a milestone after this meeting to kind of track what we want to include in that 0.3.0 release, and anyone can feel free to add things that they think would make sense as part of, you know, additive changes to V1 Alpha 1. And then once we're comfortable with what we have in V1 Alpha 1, we can start transitioning towards breaking changes for V1 Alpha 2. I know I added this, something like for April for V1 Alpha 2. I think more realistically, April is probably a reasonable timeline for 0.3.0. I don't know. Does anyone feel that's reasonable? I'll take silence as complete agreement, as always. Cool. All right, well, there's a lot of PRs and we've taken a lot of time talking about release timelines. So let me go ahead and start running through these. Tried to get them in relative order. Last time we went through issues first and didn't make it to many PRs. So flipping the order around this time. This is a good PR that I think we may have talked about earlier, but I wanted to revisit it because I don't think we have a complete conclusion yet. This is a good catch that throughout Kubernetes APIs, empty string is used to refer to the core API. And currently in our API, we have some concepts where we default group when it's not specified to be our own gateway API group. That makes sense for things like route selector, where we expect if you don't specify anything, it's us. This is messy because if someone is used to empty string meaning core and empty string actually is interpreted as gateway API, that feels like a rather confusing experience. I am increasingly thinking, for lack of ambiguity, maybe we should remove our defaults to the networking group entirely. But I am open to other feedback on this one. Does anyone know of prior art where we...
Isn't that, yeah, that seems to be maybe too backwards looking, because as things get moved into the respective API groups, wouldn't this just, like, let's say that we said that, okay, yeah, everything just refers to core, but core is kind of frozen. So from here on out, like, all references would just have to refer to those sets of objects inside core. I do understand the understandability aspect of this, but at the same time, it's almost like we might be propagating something that becomes less and less useful going forward.
Yeah, I admit that a core reference here is unlikely to be useful. I can't imagine a time where anyone is going to, in route binding selector, where anyone is going to want to reference it doesn't make sense. There is no core resource that is a route, and I can't imagine that there ever will be. I can't imagine there will ever be a new core API resource at all. But if users are used to empty string representing one thing, and they use it to represent something else in their YAML manifest or whatever here, that feels confusing.
What I'm saying is that like we should be careful because right now there's a lot of types in core, but then core is frozen. So like, 2 years from now, most types will actually exist outside of core. And like in that scenario, looking back, then it doesn't make sense to just kind of forcibly, then the defaulting has very little value, period.
Yeah, that does make sense. Maybe this is something where we need a API machinery perspective or something
Basically,
go ahead.
if the defaulting has no value because it defaults to types that basically there's like a nothing there right after defaulting, then we should just remove the defaulting, period. Which is tantamount to what we are saying here. And in that sense, it might be even more confusing that we're defaulting to something that is not useful.
Right, that is what I was saying. I was saying we could require this field and remove a default. Again, this would be a breaking change, but that does just require more YAML everywhere and more explicit references. But maybe a default group is not.
Yeah, let's follow up with API. It just feels unnatural to force default. It's like we should be careful about using precedence because precedence also, like the precedence was set because everything was in core. Or I don't know if it was intended a consequence. It's just like if everything was already in that situation, do we continue it? Or the sort of the thought process behind it was simply to make defaulting a natural thing that makes users' lives easier.
Yeah, I don't know on this one. I can try and follow up with someone in API machinery to see how strict that requirement is. I don't know. This is a messy one, and I hate to go too far away from that precedent that is an upstream. But
is it like a explicit precedent? Because if you are a reference in the core group, like what choice do you have? You can't actually refer to anything outside of core.
Wait. No, if you're a reference inside the core group, what do you mean? I mean,
well, what I mean is that if you, anyways, I think this is, we should just discuss it with API machinery. I feel like, if you're in the core group and you use one of these reference types, then for sure you can't reference outside groups anyways. So you'll always default to core. So I don't know whether that requirement was actually an explicit requirement.
Before you move on, Rob, I just wanted to make a quick suggestion. I think it is possible for us to there is another way to work around this, and that's to not have the validation stop you from using the empty string, and then put like in the implementation notes to say, to just mandate that an empty string must be treated as the core API. You can punt this question for now and say, if we don't if you don't mandate it, then if you don't empty a thing, then it's the core string to keep up with the rest of the things. But but the default value will be the the
Networking group.
The networking group.
Yeah, I thought about that too, and that may be the best solution. What made me hesitate there is, so that would require making group a pointer, as I understand it, to differentiate the two. Then what you end up with is, at least someone who's interacting with this from YAML perspective, there's a pretty fine line between empty string and pointer when you're not using a Go interface, when you're not using Go. There's a pretty fine line between unspecified and empty. And so for them to have such significantly different values could get confusing.
I think that's a very fair point. So I think you're right that talking to API machinery is probably a good idea.
Cool. Well, thanks for the feedback. Yeah, this tricky defaults and tricky precedents here. So I can follow up on this one. All right, implementations documentation. I think this already got merged. I added this yesterday. Yeah. So thank you, Shane, for seeing this through. Lots of good feedback on here. And I think there were a few follow-ups for different implementations.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, cool. Well, I guess we can leave it to those implementations to clean up any little bits they want to, but it looks like this is a great start. I already looked through the implementation stocks on the site and excited to see it all live. Great. Danny, and I think this one is yours. Update top docs for fields of type local object reference. I think this just needed a bit of follow-up. Oh, I haven't paid attention. Is there anything this just needs another round of review at this point?
Yeah, you addressed the feedback from Harry and Bowie.
Perfect. And I think the only feedback was there was a config map suggestion, and that's changed to secret in a number of places.
Correct.
Okay.
And then there's just some additional information there at line 112 about certificate authority reference being in a config map.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, I'll leave that to Harry or Bowie to follow up on, but looks close. All right. Mark, you had a large PR here that probably deserves a bit more discussion in this meeting. This is a large overhaul of the main page, if I'm remembering correctly. Let me go down to the deploy preview. Mark, maybe do you want to give a little bit of background on what you're thinking for these changes?
Yeah, I wanted to just give a more tangible idea of what the value of the API is. I think that the first diagram is a good, hey, this API has multiple resources and it tells you that much, but you don't understand really what's the significance of that until you get to the, this really describes kind of why the role-oriented API matters, and shows kind of the different responsibilities by the roles, where this shows that TLS certificates could be configured by the gateway, by the cluster operator, but a service rollout could be configured entirely by the developer who owns the route. And so that's kind of what, and then I use that explanation as a jumping off point to link to a whole bunch of different topics, such as route binding and things like that. I realize this is a little long, and I'm fine to trim it down, but I do think it is important to provide a tangible example kind of like on the homepage. So when people get it, they understand why this, why this increased complexity exists.
Yeah, thanks for all the work on this. I really love this diagram. I think this absolutely, at least this diagram and the content around it belongs on the main page, because to me, it's a really good, tangible example of what is in scope for this API, like what you might actually use this for and what the different resources represent, right? I think this is really valuable. I like that you included, where policies might be attached, how, traffic splitting, cross namespace references. Like these are all things that are relatively new in this API that are cool. And I think this is a compelling introduction. My concern going through it, like I really like this getting started section. You revamped it some. Start with API overview, user guides, etc., links to gateway controller implementations. There are great things here, but I think this may be getting to be a bit long. Like you kind of already said, like it may take a while for people to actually get down here and notice this or notice the getting started. I think a lot of the content is good, but maybe not all of it belongs on the main page, but I don't know.
Yeah, I'm fine with, striking the portable API. We can find a home for that later. And then we can move up getting started and getting involved to above the why role oriented API matters to make sure that's, almost above the fold. And then slim down some of this content.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anyone else have any feedback or thoughts on this one?
Looks awesome.
Yeah. Mark, I just have to say thank you for all your diagrams. They're 1,000 times better than anything I would ever make. So thank you.
helps. I think we're probably getting a lot of new users that are, not implementers, and so I think we're starting to broach a new crowd that really needs this kind of content. So yeah, just good timing.
Yeah, appreciate it. All right, well, the next one is a fix for an issue that I had created earlier. There were a couple small PRs that came in that fixed this issue on individual fields. So we were not consistently using pointers for optional fields. I think someone from Knative found this out as they were trying to use Go API to and just leave fields empty, and that did not work as expected. They were being set as empty string, and that was validation error. I think that's approximately what happened. So even though this kind of worked from YAML perspective, it did not work for the Go API. So I created an issue that this one fixes that basically says we should be using pointers for any optional type that is not a map or a slice. I believe that's the correct interpretation here. So this API, this PR goes through and just, we have a lot of pointers now. I want to make sure, I feel like I'm certainly not the authority on this. This is my understanding of what we should be doing based on the API guidelines. But if anyone else wants to, maybe Danny, I know you've looked at these guidelines a lot too. If anyone else wants to confirm that this understanding is correct, it'd be good to make sure before we actually merge this in. But I do think this PR is pretty straightforward as long as this is what we want, and I think it is. I just want someone to sanity check my interpretation of the contributor guidelines or API guidelines.
I'm not so sure about that. I remember we've had long discussions about whether the selector should be nullable.
Which selectors? Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. Selector is a tricky one because a nil selector has a very different value than an empty selector in the true interpretation of a label selector. That's a good catch. I think, yeah, let me run through here and look at any other label selectors that changed. The one label selector that changed here seems appropriate because this can only be specified when another field is specified, and when it is required, and empty isn't, you know. So in that case, I think this may be the appropriate change. But yeah, thank you for reminding me about selectors and their weird interpretation. Cool. All right, the last PR that I've noticed, and if there's any more, let me know, but it's just a tiny one from Bowie. I think this is really straightforward. Might conflict with what Mark's PR, I'm not sure, but this looks good. An actual link to our implementations now that we have it, very helpful. Changing cloud to Kubernetes engine. Yeah, okay. These all seem really straightforward. I can approve this. If anyone sees an issue, feel free to add some feedback on here real quick. Otherwise, I'll approve it after the meeting. All right, I think we're into issues. There's a few of these. Steve, thank you for raising this issue. This came up in two rather long Slack threads that were a couple weeks apart. And I think most of us have commented on here now. Maybe, Steve, do you want to provide your current understanding of what we should be doing, or what the consensus is, and then we can agree or disagree on that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I had a question implementing because the port was optional. But I think looking through, and that was done. So I was chatting with Daniel offline or in Slack and other places. So he had made a change to make this optional. And then in my misunderstanding of how this worked, he mentioned, hey, maybe we should undo this. But thinking about it some more, reading through some Slack threads and stuff, I think it might make sense to leave it as is, meaning port is optional because you could use it with a service name on a forward to, or if you had a backend ref, you maybe want to define the port there differently. So I think it's just going to come down to implementation in terms of what's valid or not valid for whatever use case you have. If you've got the service defined but not a port, and vice versa. So I think actually as is probably fine. We can close this, but I'm curious to see what other folks think as well.
So if you have a service without a port, what does that mean?
Right, I think that's an error.
Oh, okay. So it's
Yeah.
optional, but not optional if you have service name specified. Like it's optional only if you're using backend ref. Is that what we're going for?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. Yeah, to me, if you're using a backend ref, then the backend ref is going to define how to handle that port. The other way to do it would be to remove port from the backend ref and use this same port for everything.
Just to clarify, I thought that backend ref, when it was defined inside route, was actually using something like more generic, like local object reference. I thought forward to .backend ref does not include port. I can't remember though.
Yeah, I don't think the local object reference does. but the policy does, right? Doesn't the policy have a port?
Yeah, and I think backend policy, that makes sense, because backend policy is, I want to apply this to a service or a port, and I make a service or a backend, one and the same, I guess, in this case. And in that case, do you want to apply it to all of the service or just a specific port on that service or that backend if the backend has multiple ports?
Why don't we just do what Ingress does? They have resource, which is the same as our backend ref, and then they have service, which has name and port underneath it, whereas we have port and service at the same level as backend ref, which causes this ambiguity of what does port mean with service and what does port mean with backend ref.
So instead of service name, it being just service, and within the service would be the name of the service and the port of the service you use.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit more verbose, but it's what Ingress does, so it's at least familiar. Maybe that's not a goal, is to be familiar with Ingress, but that's just one idea. I'm sure we could solve this in other ways too, though.
No, it's not a bad approach. I guess one option could be is that port is ignored if backend reference is set. So port, kind of as John was just mentioning, is really only for service name. And backend ref is used when you want to use something like a backend policy.
Yeah, or like they can be implementation specific, right? Because backend ref, everything there is implementation specific. We don't have any standard things to refer to. So maybe they use port, maybe they don't. But I don't really know what we were going to use backend ref for, so maybe that doesn't make sense. But I could imagine a port potentially being useful there.
Yeah, because I mean, my mental model is like, if you specify a service name, or if we alter it to be service, and within the service, it's the name of the service and the port of the service. Like, to me, that just thinks like, okay, and my mental model is like, okay, we're now forwarding to a service. We're not forwarding it to, a backend policy to do something else with the request before it gets forwarded, right? If you want to do something else, then use backend ref, which could be a backend policy. And again, we either put port, as you mentioned, John, under service, rename service name to service, and then service is the name of the service and the port of the service. Or we keep port as is. We update the docs to say that it's ignored, or that it's only used when service name is specified. And then again, backend ref could be something implementation specific, or we could even, or it's used for backend policy.
It has to.
Yeah, that's interesting what you said about the backend, like forwarding to a backend policy versus forwarding to a service. And this may be like my service mesh bias, but to me, I always thought that the backend policy is just like the server configuring their settings, and the route just sends to their service. They don't know or care if that has a backend policy or not. They can't not send to that backend policy. Like, that's not something that you can configure in the API, because that's like the server side configuration that they're setting. And it's not like you would say, I want to forward to the service or the backend policy. You just say, I want to forward to the service. And if they have a backend policy, then that's used. I don't know if that's how the API is meant to be used, but that's how I interpreted it, at least.
That matches up with my intent as well. Backend policy was designed, at least from my perspective, as something that was basically a decorator, something that augmented service or other kinds of backend resources with various bits of policy or additional information that applied universally to that specific backend or set of backends. So, some basic examples of something like that would really only be applicable to that specific application, let's say, regardless of what gateway or route was talking to it. And routes still just target the backend directly, and backend policy is just kind of some extra metadata policy, etc., that's associated with that backend. But you would never forward to a backend policy. That was my understanding and intent. And I think that's probably where some of the confusion is coming from here.
Right. And if that is the case, then I think it comes down to what do we do with port, right? Do we change service so that it's a struct, and within service, we've got the name of the service and the port of the service, or we keep it as is and we just update the docs of port to say that that it's ignored or only use something along those lines for a service name.
So I don't even know that we need that, because backend ref, as you pointed out earlier, is only a local object reference, which does not include port. So we don't have an issue where we have more than one way to specify port here. You're specifying this port field applies to either the service that's being referenced or the backend that's being referenced. At least that's my understanding of this configuration. And there's no extra port in backend ref, even though that's confusing because we have a field with the same name on backend policy that does include port. This one does not.
I think
Yeah,
like
Rob, could you, sorry, Bowie, just really quickly though, Rob, could you go to the examples? Because this is what really has thrown me off. Go to the examples, look at the TLS upstream example, and that to me is the problem. Or upstream TLS, something upstream. Gateway API examples, upstream TLS. So look at the route, and it's saying, okay, forward to this service on port 8443, which is the target port of the service, which seems like it would actually be the service port 443. But then go up and look at, right, because we're using a backend policy here that also specifies a port, but it's a different port, right? And I get that this probably looks like a configuration error, but this is just like the core of the issue is like people are going to be confused here, or it's open for these types of problems where we have port in the backend ref, have port in the HTTP route as well.
This is an example where we really could use a good diagram explaining the relationship. From my perspective, we have two resources here that are both pointing at the same service and doing different things.
actually, I'm curious about this example. Why is the HTTP route pointed at 8443 as opposed to 44?
It shouldn't be.
Yeah, I think that's wrong. Yeah.
But even if it were pointing to 443, I can understand how you could look at this example and be confused.
Would it be less confusing? Because I think it's confusing because it's pointing the wrong place right now.
Yeah, it would be less confusing. Yeah.
Hold on, you're saying it shouldn't use the target port, it should use the port?
Right, because it's forwarding to the service, not the service endpoints. It's forwarding to 443 on service my service.
Is it going through kube proxy?
You don't have to go through kube proxy, but that's the API that's exposed through the user, right? It's the same with Ingress, right? Ingress, you forward to the service port, and most implementations that I know of, at least, they don't actually send to that service IP. They go directly to the pod IPs, but they could go through kube proxy if they wanted, and that's kind of an implementation detail.
Yeah, the implementation does the magic of finding the endpoints associated to that service and just reporting to the endpoint instead of to the actual service, right?
Yeah, but it uses the target port.
So I think the important distinction here is that, and it's really important in this case, is that if you have on the outside of the service, the ports are 80 and 443, and that means that if you need to construct any URLs, like say an automatic redirect, then you don't include the port in the thing, because the fact that the service has 80 and 443 on it actually implies that the URLs are using the standard ports. This came up for me when I was doing some contour stuff. that's the main reason to care about what the port is in the service. I think that logically it makes sense that the service is like your load balancer. I'm making air quotes here that you can't see, but you know, and how your implementation references that load balancer is up to it. But in terms of the traffic path you're defining is that you're saying that the traffic should go to this port on the, like, again, air quotes, load balancer.
And
So-
plus, there's a difficulty where I think target port can be a string, so wouldn't work.
Yeah. So I think that it's important. It's a subtle but really important distinction that I would actually, to be honest, in the example here, I would actually make sure there's no target port and just make it so there's ports, just to make it so that you don't have to have this discussion. And so it's a bit clearer to read. I think in practice, probably a lot of people will end up using a target port, but it does make it more confusing, because then you have to understand that the service, in this case, the service will actually do the sort of the port translation for you from port to target port. And that the fact that the implementations will look up the target port and use that to actually forward the traffic to is an implementation specific detail, not an API thing.
Well, it's important whether the port specified in HTTP route is supposed to be the port of the service or the target port of the service.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I'm making the argument that it should be the port of the service, because that's the outer surface of the service API.
Yeah, the target port is an implementation inside the service to denote which thing it picks up from the pod. It's not meant to be the outside that people should target. And so it should be a validation error, actually, if you target a target port, because it's technically not accessible from outside the service.
Is it absolutely necessary to allow specifying a number?
For the forward to port?
On the route. I mean, it would be a much nicer and less confusing API if you said you have to use a named port.
Well, this is one of these original design things. So you need to just disambiguate multiple ports, especially services that have ports that have different meanings. Like you have to pick one.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you can have a service without a name if you only have one port. And that's the scenario. Well, that's in the scenario where the port doesn't have a name. And is it really necessary to support that scenario, or would it be reasonable to say, if your route is going to target a service, your service's port must be named, and then you must use that name in the route?
Do people actually like names better than numbers unanimously? Like, it's much more explicit to me, at least, that it's going to port 80 than it's going to my foobar port.
I like it.
Like in Ingress, you can do both. It would be odd to only have name, in my opinion. Only having port is one thing. Maybe it's the wrong idea, but only having name seems not very common to me.
Yeah, I'd
So
agree with that.
there was a reason to this madness. Why we chose number is that actually resolving all of these slight indirections, for example, to the name of the port, and then from the port to the target port, and the target port to the container port on the pod, that actually incurs a performance penalty and a scalability issue. So we were trying to use sort of the absolute like numbers and to avoid those lookups.
Yeah, I definitely have a preference to targeting the port number, and I think it also is relevant because this same port number can be used for a backend reference as well as instead of the service name. So if backend reference is specified instead of service name, the same port field can apply. I know that could potentially be confusing, but I think any backend that you're forwarding traffic to is going to be listening on a port. So it seems relevant. And I know we're way past time here. I think there's a couple clear follow-ups here. One, if anyone wants to volunteer, this example looks like it could use some cleanup. I like the ideas to definitely change this port that is being targeted to 443 and optionally remove these target ports so we don't have any kind of confusion here. I think both would be good improvements. And then it looks like we probably need a bit more discussion on the issue that kind of started this. We've had a number of Slack threads discussing this, but it would be good to actually capture this discussion on GitHub as well, because it's a bit easier to track what we were thinking. So I know there's lots of opinions here, but if we can try and write some of them down here, it'd be great to have them for reference.
Yeah, at the core of that is we need to figure out port. Is it optional or is it required?
And we need to document explicitly what that port is, because the documentation is ambiguous and I interpreted it differently from the way everybody else apparently is interpreting it.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Okay, great. Yeah, if anyone can follow up on this issue with some of those items, that would be great. And I can create a follow-up issue as well to tackle that that little example update. But I know we're out of time, so thank you everyone for the great discussion, and we'll talk to everyone next week.